You think about it again, you go back to previous conflicts and the loss of life was, extremely high. And then, as we got better intelligence, we had more precision, we're able to, use more effective weapon systems. Thankfully, the loss of lives for our personnel decreased, and then you get down to zero. So then it became the public expectation that there will be no loss of life in armed conflict, which that's, a very dangerous expectation to set.
Welcome, everybody, to the third episode of Defense Disrupted. I am your host, Ian Kalin, CEO and co-founder of Turbine One. I am honored to welcome our guest today. It is Daniel Simpson, call sign D-Day, retired Major General from the U.S. Air Force. D-Day, sir, thank you so much for joining me today.
Ian, thanks for having me here. So I'm looking forward to this.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to start things off, some rapid fire pieces as a means to give you an open platform to introduce yourself. First question, what was your best job in the Air Force?
Oh, that is tough. So I actually could say two, because most of the time is like when you're in combat operations, that is the best and worst job at the time frame, but you're actually using all those skills that you had to train for. But I would say best job was being an instructor at the Air Force's weapons school. And it was because of the mission that we did and the personnel that you were surrounded with. Just an unbelievable level of talented folks, whether it was flying, if it was intelligence, space, command and control. I mean, you're surrounded by some of the best in the Air Force, and then training folks to go on and try and get the field, up to a higher level. It was amazing. And, close friends still to this day for all the fun. So it was painful to go through that school as a student for 5.5 months, but imagine keeping that same pace for 3 years as an instructor.
Brilliant. And what was your worst job in the Air Force? You can go to the early days. Don't feel towards the end.
No, I can honestly say my first 3 tours were operational, a lot of deployments. And then I got pulled into Air Force Special Operations Command, and then immediately got pulled into 1003 Victor planning, and then planning for the Iraq invasion part 2 for 2003. So after rolling out of that and that kind of ops tempo, I came back to AFSOC, and my 06 boss decided that I needed staff experience, which was probably true, but I was going to fight it tooth and nail. So he put me into plans and special programs. So I was trapped doing staff work and never done it before as a major. Yeah, that was not quite as fun as I wanted it to be.
So much of the work that you have done seems to be defined by the people you were working with. Can you share some stories, either of the teams or the individual people, of some of your favorite people that you were working with over the years? And by the way, how many years were you active duty in the Air Force?
So 38 years.
38 years. Okay.
I enlisted, then the Air Force Academy Prep School, then the Air Force Academy, and then commissioned officer. So, all that tells you is I'm a glutton for punishment. Tend to do things the hard way. There's an easy way and a hard way, and I'll go the hard way.
Oh, we're going with the D-Day way here, sir.
Right. Yeah. Some favorite people that I've had. So I can give you like 3 off the top of my head. So one was when I was a lieutenant in a Strike Eagle squadron, the operations officer, a lieutenant colonel. Strike Eagle crewed aircraft, you got a pilot and a weapons system operator, and we were short on Wizzos. So he came up to me, and this is Boom Boom Turcot, and he'd always talk to you zipping his flight suit. And Boom Boom said, "I'm tired of losing sorties because somebody went duty not including flying, DNIF. So go to the altitude chamber, come back and see me when you get back." So I went to the altitude chamber, and then he says, "All right, go see life support." And I got fitted out with all my own equipment. So my G suit, helmet, mask, the whole thing. And then he says, "All right, now when I come into you and tell you that, hey, somebody went DNIF today, congratulations, you're going to go flying." I'm like, "All right, sir." And then when the Wizzos in the squadron heard about that, they're like, "Whoa, first, none of us are ever going to get sick, so we're not going to let D-Day fly. Second is, well, if he is going to be in the back seat, he's not going to be a bag of sand. He's going to learn how to run the radar, learn how to run the targeting pod. he's going to be value added in the back seat. So they put me through a mission qualification training program. So I got to fly a lot in those 3 years that I was there. And it always, for him, the thing I always thought about was not putting somebody into just a box. He's like, hey, I have a need. I think this individual's got the right skill set. Even though he's not trained to be aircrew, we'll get him up to speed. Was it my primary job? No. Was it a blast? Yes. Did it help me do my intelligence job a lot better? Without a doubt. Because now being able to experience the things that they were doing in the air and see it firsthand, I was able to tailor, the intelligence that I was given the crews, whether it was, threat information or during mission planning or during mission execution. So I always, thought it was great when Boom Boom did that. The second one that I'd say is the retired Army 4-star Scotty Miller. General Miller was former commander of JSOC, and then move over to become the commander of U.S. Forces Afghanistan and commander of Resolute Support, the NATO mission. So he'd asked me to come back. I had just been in Afghanistan, and I was sitting in NORAD and NORTHCOM as the J2, and he asked me to come back. And so I told him that I wouldn't do it for anyone else other than him. And he was just that much of a fantastic leader. And again, somebody else who didn't bin individuals based off of what tribe they grew up in. He went with very much the best athlete approach. So I found myself doing some things that I never thought I would be doing, like, being his rep and negotiating with the Taliban, or going over and talking to President Ghani to be able to deliver some messages, or, coordinating hostage release with the Taliban and with my good buddy Fariz Hamad, who was the ISI general in Pakistan. So, areas that I'd never thought as an intelligence professional, as a director of intelligence at J2, I never thought that I would be doing some of those things. So that was pretty amazing. Senior enlisted leader that I was lucky enough to have,
yes.
Chief Master Sergeant Tom Good. So former military training instructor, so a drill instructor for the Air Force. Grew up in Scotland, so heavy Scottish accent. So imagine going to basic training and you're getting yelled at, and you're getting yelled at by somebody with a Scottish accent. One of the most professional and attention to detail individuals that I have ever seen. So, and I hired him out of Afghanistan. I'd never worked with him before to help be my command chief for a group that had started, and it was starting with about 500 people. And by the time we left 2 years later, we're over 1,600 people. But what I charged him to be my, the emperor has no clothes. He needed to be the devil's advocate. He needed to look at my blind spots to make sure that, and at times, come in and shut the door and go, this is not something that we need to be doing. So to have those moments, and he took full advantage of that. And I think I learned more from him and those interactions because of the pulse that he had with the people and the mission. And it was always, after one of those sessions, you'd come back in and go, sir, this is just absolutely stupid. And then we go through all the rationale. And it usually didn't hit me until much later that night, the amount of things I was learning from him. So yeah, you asked for one, I gave you three.
No, that's brilliant. I think that's to the point of what we are seeking to explore in this podcast, is this overarching theme with the people at the front lines of what it takes to affect national security. So many brilliant pearls in those stories. I wish I could just go deep dive into each one of them. At the risk of missing the headline, I was going to avoid asking you about your call sign, but then you brought up another call sign, Boom Boom. And that's just too damn good. I got to go back and say, okay, well, rather than ask you that story about another gentleman, can you tell us, please, how did you get your call sign? What is that referring to?
So I will give you the sanitized version. My wife says you are no longer allowed to tell how you actually got your call. In the Air Force, you get a call sign for usually one of two things. It's either a play off of your name or you did something incredibly stupid. I did both. We're going to concentrate on the play off of the name, and depending on who's listening to the podcast, some people may go, I've never heard of this movie. So I will charge them to go look at and have fun with it. Movie called Animal House.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So do you remember the character D-Day? So
no, I remember a lot of things.
He rode his motorcycle up the flight of stairs, crushed the...
Oh, that guy. Oh yeah. But that wasn't the John Belushi character.
No.
Yeah.
Drove the Deathmobile.
Okay.
So it tended to cause a lot of havoc. They said his name once throughout the entire movie, and it was in Dean Wormer's office. And it said, Daniel Simpson Day has no grade point average. All courses incomplete. So Daniel Simpson, that made it easy. And then if you
Yeah.
did something incredibly stupid on a motorcycle as a lieutenant, that made it very easy.
Anchors it into life for
Yeah.
38 extraordinary years.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for sharing that sanitized version. We're trying to have a family-friendly podcast here, something our kids can listen to.
Yeah.
From those years of experience and the extraordinary folks you work with, I'd love to learn a bit more from you personally, let alone for the listeners here, about what you're seeing in this next chapter of American national security. And before I get into it, though, and some broad questions about how things are evolving and what's going on in the world, I think it's okay for me to just level set that as an intelligence professional, we were joking before this podcast started recording that you feel perhaps a little uncomfortable about this experience. Why is that? Why is it that perhaps for those that aren't part of that community that you've served in for many years, or that don't understand the special operations culture, they just haven't lived it. Why is it that there's a little bit of hesitancy to share some stories from your past experiences, get you to educate the non-military folks that don't quite get it?
Yeah, it is interesting because as an intelligence professional, you were paid to keep secrets. You shared the intelligence with the folks that you were teamed with, but I mean, it was, how did you get it? How did you collect it? You didn't want that source, that capability to go away. And then working with special operations, it was even more operations security conscious. And then you get some of the special access and some of those areas. So, I really tried to avoid doing public speaking because I was always concerned about what kind of questions I had. I had to get used to it, but I will say, the same thing that I would say if I had to be at a podium and answering questions at a conference. If you see me pause, I'm not having a senior moment. I'm actually thinking about how can I answer this question in a way that will not ensure that, or that will ensure that neither one of us go to jail. And, I didn't violate some 1,000 NDAs that I had to say that you'd never divulge this capability. So and some things you can actually talk about now, which is great. And there's other things you're like, well, that's still, that's tactics, techniques, procedures, or that's tradecraft. And, that may put somebody's life at risk. So if you pause, I'm not doing a senior moment.
I'll try to balance that out. I won't take it as an equal offense. Ooh, I'm not asking hard-hitting enough questions. I need to find a way to create more pauses. Now, having served a bit, I completely empathize, and thanks for laying that out in the way that you did. I think it'll help folks understand that this is incredibly important to have some degree of transparency and honest conversations about in the public domain. But absolutely, so much of what we're talking about, particularly in the intelligence world, is supposed to be kept secret as quiet professionals. So with that balancing act declared and expectations established, just as there's a broad perspective on American national defense, do you think it's being disrupted today? Is this a moment of a transition and even chaotic times, or is this just another version of the tradecraft?
I think it is, if you go back and look at history, there's always times that our nation has been challenged. I would say that right now, we have since the end of World War II, our nation has gotten so used to being, the largest kid on the block with the most toys, the most money, and the most capability. So you go World War II, we were definitely fighting, peer and above peer adversaries in the beginning. So, that was a peer type of fight. But, and you could say that in Korea as well. But as you continued on in further conflicts, we faced a different type of adversary. And that's, obviously not including the Cold War portion where you definitely, had a peer adversary. But I think now, especially the past, I would say 3 decades of enjoying, pretty dominant capability on the military side of the house, that is given time to other adversaries to be able to develop either symmetric capabilities or asymmetric capabilities to hold us at risk. So we can talk, and I'm sure we will talk at length about China and how they've done with the very large amount of investment that they put across the board. But you can also say same thing if you look at Russia. So you have a Putin probably would be upset with me for calling him it's a second, he's not a first world power. He's a second world power with nuclear weapons. But I would say he's a second world power with nuclear weapons and a robust cyber capability. The same thing with the Iranians. You now have somebody who's trying to develop the capability to quickly enter the nuclear market, although they keep saying that that's not their intent. But that used to be on years, and then it was months, and now it's on the measure of days. If they wanted to, if they had that intent, they could get there. Now, delivery vehicle would be something different. How would they actually deliver those? But if you look at what they've done on the cyber side of the house, there's another one that is developed a lot of capability. And, initially we thought, well, they must be getting a lot of help from the Chinese or the Russians or other folks, and maybe a little bit in the beginning, but now they come into their own right. So I would say that is one area, we would say that our nation is at peace. And I would disagree, because I would say in the cyber domain, that is one of the most violently contested environments right now across the board. And it's not just on the military side of the house. And because there are no ramifications, or very limited ramifications, for either nation states or third-party actors for their actions, it's going to continue. So, that's the challenge. So you think about war in the traditional kinetic mindset, that is one of the asymmetric areas that I've seen nations start to move into. And then we can talk about, China's evolving capabilities or seriously evolving capabilities and how they expect to fight in the future.
Yeah, just to reflect that back, I'm internalizing, I think, a few different elements, right? Or kind of drives. On one side, I think you started to say from a historic perspective, not necessarily that different in American history in terms of great power competition or, who's the big kid on the block, or just evolving powers rising and falling. But then there's this everyday warfare of cybersecurity. And then at the same time, it feels like there is something that is kind of ever present of the threats and competitions from these bad actors, bad nations that have the intent or the capability to create bad dynamics in a very short period of time. I have my own personal opinion about this, but I'm also just trying to get your sense of it. Does it feel then like this is an urgent moment, or just, part of that same, like there's like the threat level and then there's disruption, right? Like if you can have a high threat condition and nothing's going on. I can be force protection Delta or Charlie, hey, airport's on high alert, but we're still launching planes every day. Like, it's like, okay, well, it's high sensitivity, but that's just the level of threat that you tolerate and work through every single day. And then there's the disruptions, urgent moment, imminent attack, quick, hide the president. There's like those kind of disruptive scenarios. From a macro perspective, do you see shocks coming into the system, or is it just the everyday threat level? Does that make sense? What I'm curious about?
Yeah, I definitely know what you're talking about. And I think it is beyond the everyday threat level. So if it was the norm, and it's amazing what the citizens of our great nation have gotten used to, over many years. You think about it again. You go back to previous conflicts, and the loss of life was extremely high. And then as we got better intelligence, we had more precision, we're able to use more effective weapon systems. Thankfully, the loss of lives for our personnel decreased, and then you get down to zero. So then it became the public expectation that there will be no loss of life in armed conflict, which that's a very dangerous expectation to set. But that is kind of where it's been the threshold of, okay, so we are so good that nobody can possibly challenge us. And, I think there are still some out there who actually believe that. Some of the unfortunate time I've had to spend on the Hill while in uniform in the last job, we had elected members who still had that as a mindset and did not see what's coming down the pipe at us. So I'll specifically focus on China for this one. That's where I would say for a lot of the other nations, we're running fairly constantly, except for China. And the capabilities, the mass, and the quality of what China is fielding is at a pace that we are not keeping up with at all. I do not refer to China as a near peer competitor. They are absolutely a peer competitor in every single domain, especially if we're going to do it in their backyard. Now you take that as, that's my assertion. You look at that to how they're fielding capabilities. So you got their quality equipment becoming more and more advanced. And, the one thing that you thought about, well, the Chinese don't really exercise. They don't train the way that they're going to fight. So that's, they don't exercise to operate as a joint force. These are all things that they have watching us. So they're getting a lot of learning by having watched us over the past 3 decades of armed conflict of, wow. So if we ever want to fight, or if we're going to have to fight the United States, here's some things that we would like to, take advantage of. We see how they're going to fight. Oh, they're very dependent on space-based assets to provide a myriad of functions. Very command and control. They can operate very agilely if you let them into a theater. So try not to let them into the theater. So all things that they're looking at it from their perspective, how do they protect their area? And then fielding those capabilities at a pace that we're not keeping up with. So if you imagine we're in a foot race, the foot race is, the gap is opening. So you're like, oh, we can close. No, it continues to open. So the Chinese are going faster, whereas we're not. And some of that is, how do we acquire and field new capabilities? Some of it is, in our republic, it's, the cost of doing business in dealing with the bureaucracy we have, and Xi doesn't have that kind of, sometimes it's good to be the president for life, and he doesn't have a lot of those limitations to be able to go through things fairly quickly. So they're fielding things at a pace that we are currently not keeping up with, and in some areas is putting us at a disadvantage.
It's a really powerful statement you made before about it's peer competition, not near peer competition. As a personal reflection, I actually like engaging with folks on the Hill and in Congress. You said it was a terrible aspect of previous work. I don't know what that says about me, but I actually kind of enjoy it. But whenever I hear that phrase in DC, to be honest, I was always kind of curious about it. I didn't know if it was vanity or branding or politics. We're saying that because anything less than that would admit some ceding of the primacy position or pole position, however you say that. And I remember just thinking to myself, like, who came up with that phrase? Because it felt contrived, like the title is the story, right? And as opposed to what some other aspect of a honest, rigorous, competitive assessment. Yeah, and also, by the way, a little bit of, I think so much of the American ethos is to celebrate the underdog. I think it's part of American culture and storytelling. Everyone loves that movie, Rudy, right? The football player was a little too short, but yet, once you're at the top, do we ever admit that someone's coming close? What does that mean for us? I think that's what whoever came up with that phrase, it was trying to spur was a level of competitive action. But I think what you just said is much more compelling. That the China, in this particular example, is racing ahead or moving faster. I think is a better way of saying, more accurately described if reflecting back. What I think I heard, it's a very powerful statement. And so I'd love to dig deeper into that and to mention the different components and different elements. Well, let's, as particularly in the, I think, great ambition for any father or lawmaker or general is to have, zero or as little as possible loss of life and risk and damage. Obviously, that's a human responsibility and obligation. One of the ways in which we as a nation are seeking to accomplish that is with greater deployment of autonomous systems. So autonomy, the robots, the drones, the surface craft, the subsurface craft, that's a pretty exciting area for investors. A lot of money flowing into that space right now. Do you see that as a major disruption in this category? Do you see us leading, catching up? Is it really that new from other aspects of technological deployment?
I would say right now we're in the lead, but I would say several nations are paying attention. And I would say it kind of really all started, you would think about it, we would say that it started with the MQ-1 Predator as the first kind of, remotely piloted aircraft. So It's not autonomous, but remotely piloted aircraft. But, if you go back, I tend to do a lot with World War II, but you think about the V1 and the V2, the buzz bomb, now you had a autonomous, missile that was launched that was doing the mission of what a manned bomber was supposed to do into London. So that concept's been around for a little bit while, but it was, shoot from point A and land at point B, and you didn't modify it all as we're going. And then you as we field new capabilities and new systems, now you have capabilities like a cruise missile being able to determine that, I'm supposed to be a low radar cross section thing, and my flight path is going to put me at risk of being detected. So I may modify my flight path so I can make sure that I maintain that low visibility that I need to be able to have the surprise and hit the target that I want to. So is that a level of autonomy? Well, if you're modifying it in flight, I would say that is, it's not picking its own targets, but it is modifying its flight parameters and how it's going to do that. And you can say the same thing from a maritime perspective, and either surface or subsurface autonomous vessels, given an area, search area to look into. So I think we're developing more capabilities in those areas. And actually, as we evolve from, machine learning to actually some types of, I'm always leery to say the word in artificial intelligence, because usually when somebody says that, you're like, okay, what does that mean to you? Because you talk to three people and they're going to have three different definitions. But as we move towards something that is more a generative artificial intelligence, where it's now able to recognize and make decisions, or at times make recommendations for decisions, I'd say right now we currently have the advantage. But now you have a lot of folks who notice that as a path and are trying to catch up, and, specifically China, but to a lesser extent, Russia. And then you have some other, nations that we do a lot of work with. I'm not going to call them frenemies, but, they are fielding capability that, could be a potential threat down the road as we field more of these autonomous portions. But that is usually one question that I get is, so let's take a look at, the one that I usually get when we start talking about artificial intelligence and targeting. So,
well, before you get there, so let me do my job. Let me ask the question. No, hold on. Don't lead the instructor here now. You're a teacher. Hold on. Let me see if I can phrase this. But let me put it in the context of where I think you're going, and also knowing a little bit about some of the folks that have been signing in to listen here. A lot of, let's say, investors look at that community. They will see AI as a techno-optimist. And I think they would say that one umbrella term, admittedly, but for all the pieces underneath artificial intelligence and machine learning, they believe broadly, many of them believe, that it is the single technological capability that would create an insurmountable advantage for warfighters. And so looking at things like Ukraine, they're seeing the public news on it and saying, that's how we accelerate the capabilities of the good guys. We need to put more of that forward. How would you respond to those techno-optimists?
You look at it for how it's going to be used. Is it going to be evolutionary or revolutionary? And people have, pretty heated discussions about which one is it, evolutionary or revolutionary. I'm more in the camp of it is not revolutionary, because we continue to evolve. It gets better and better and faster, but it's moving at a pace that could be perceived as revolutionary. And the reason I say that is, what does that level of autonomy and that assistance, give a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, guardian, coastie out there? The ability to be able to handle large amounts of data that is moving at an amazing speed, to be able to set parametrics of, I want you to look for these things because this is important. And then, you get it to either a decision maker, or you get it to an individual who's going to take that data, that information, and analyze it. And that the algorithms may actually be the analysis, or it may be a human that is adding something onto that to turn it into intelligence that is timely, relevant, and accurate. And with the ultimate goal of somebody's going to make a decision on that. So, and the decision could be, I'm going to employ kinetic effects. So I'm going to yank the lanyard, hit the pickle button, or pull the trigger. That's a commander's decision. That's not AI's decision. And, that's going to be a human being making that decision. Or does it drive something like, I need to move personnel. I need to move this ship out of this area because now they're at risk. So now it becomes a operational employment, force protection type of decision. How do I minimize or mitigate the risk to my fielded forces out there. So as we look at that evolution, I'd say it's going faster and faster and faster. So you think about it from a signals intelligence side of the house, and the amount of data that's collected, and how is, be able to, from multiple sensors, fuse that, and then able to come up to be displayed either in a operations center or on a ship or in an aircraft as, hey, there's a threat here. And that process used to take days, and then it was shortened to hours. Now it's shortened to minutes. Now it's done, down to seconds, with the goal of trying to get it as real time as you possibly can, as long as it's accurate and relevant. So how quickly can you make that happen? So, and the amount of sensors, data, the speed that are coming in, that's where I think the evolutionary portion of artificial intelligence can actually leap into the revolutionary side of the house. Because we have, the biggest concern that I had as an intelligence professional is not did we collect that, whatever we were looking for, but it was collected somewhere by someone. Where is it? Did it end up on the cutting room floor? Is it stuck in a data storage center someplace because it was not deemed relevant? So how do we find that and fuse it and get it out? Because I'll tell you that everything from lawmakers to commanders to individuals out there expect near omniscient capability for the folks who are providing those mission sets, and it needs to be worldwide.
If I can interrupt you, it's funny you mentioned that, because on a previous podcast that I don't think you had a chance to hear yet because we haven't published it, one of my colleagues explained exactly the same thing about how commanders are seeking omniscience. I almost wonder if that should be the new name of our podcast, because that seems to be what everyone here is trying to, especially in the intelligence category. But let me ask, as one of our final questions here, a very difficult, unfair question to you about something I experienced, but I'm going to try to frame it as a situation that I think directly relates to the AI topic you were just talking about. When you describe a process that used to take, days and now becomes minutes, it took days for people to do. And now if it can be done in minutes, then those very same number of people, in theory, spend less time doing the thing because the thing is done faster. So if I have 100 people doing a thing for days, and then the evolution means I can now do the same task in minutes, what does that mean as an impact to the workforce, to the training, to the retention? You can say, oh, I think the normal AI answer for the AI lovers of the world are like, oh, well, they'll just move on to higher value activities. That sounds great. But I think every commander would say, wait, it used to take this many bodies to accomplish this task. Now it's taking less bodies. Wait a second. What do we do in this situation? And I'm not necessarily asking you to opine on, the DOGE mandates of headcount reduction in the current administration. But I think it's kind of the same topic, though. It's a basic question of any organization, particularly one that has such extraordinary consequences of national security. If it used to take days and it now takes minutes, what's the new obligation for those commanders? How do they react to that situation that you were just describing?
So even before Doge, it was a thing where having the discussions about, because people are expensive, and you would like to be able to, as the military changes and certain mission sets grow and others kind of fall back, you need to be able to, if you've only got 328,000 personnel, how are you going to shift them around and move the pucks around to make sure that you're maximizing the personnel investment into our mission sets for future fights? And continuing to do business the way that it's always been done is not the most effective way to ensure success in the future. I was one who would say that, okay, that's great. AI and that level of autonomy is going to free up time. So we'll look at it from an intelligence perspective, so that I can put an analyst on more complex, more challenging, where I needed human judgment to be able to do that. And they can, the machine, let the machine do the thing that the machine's good at, fusing and consolidating data, and then letting us know when, hey, you should really pay attention here. A good example is I'm looking at a Ukraine airfield in Russia, and you're like, how many Bear bombers are supposed to be there? Well, there's supposed to be 12. I got 12. I don't need a human being to do that. I can have a system look at it, go 12, and then it goes, and there's 8. Hey, I got a problem over here. There's 8. So now you start to look, okay, Where did the 4 go? Do we have anything that indicates that? Does that need to be a human being that's doing that? But, at least that initial indication that could be fused into other processes of, okay, if you see this, the if then is you continue to work that. But with Doge and with some of the other things, it has become, the 4-letter word. It's going to be efficient. So I learned that from my A8J8N8.
Yeah. It's the 4-letter word for the 3-letter agencies and the 2-letter job titles. Yeah.
Well, efficiency, that's a bad word because that means you're going to take resources from me. That's usually what it means. My question is, can we be more effective? And when we're actually doing it, and then can I put those personnel capabilities into something else that is a higher priority at that time? Nobody likes to lose resources, but you have to look at it and go, what is best for our nation? What's best for the Department of Defense? What's best for your service? But I don't think you're going to take human beings out of it. It's going to be shrunk down and it can go fast. So again, if we take a look at, even if it was, say Xi has said that in 2027, he wants his forces to be prepared to have a fight in the Taiwan Straits. And they have been moving out with a purpose to be able to fulfill that obligation. Questions, people differ on whether or not they'll make it, but questions are there. But if you just think about the amount of forces, so land, sea, space, cyber, what he's going to be able to field in that area, that he's been able to very focus all his, and he's got a fantastic intelligence collection capability in that theater that they have developed over the past 10 years. Air breathing, spaceborne, ships, land. So, we are fighting in their backyard. And they have developed ways to be able to trying to keep us from getting closer, because they understand if you let the United States and coalition forces in closer, it's very difficult to dislodge them if you give them enough time and space to be able to get their stuff together. So the goal is to push us out further and further and further. And that's what a lot of those weapon systems are doing. But if you look at it from a targeting side, as we're trying to get in there, that kind of fight, just to put it in very generic terms, the speed, the pace, sheer volume and size of the target sets, dynamic targeting of things moving all over, whether it's surface to surface missiles, ships, surface to air missiles, actual viable targets, is at a scale that has not been our focus in that kind of fight for 30 years. We got very good at chasing, individuals that we wanted to take off the battlefield and very adept at that. But that is not the same as that kind of peer fight, force on force across multiple domains. And that's where I think AI, and I think autonomy is going to be extremely value added, because that is a problem that I do not believe you can throw as many humans as you possibly could, well trained, and you still would not be able to keep up with the pace of that fight.
Well, as a final question, sir, and thank you so much for the time to share what you've experienced here and your insights. I got a few takeaways that I'm going to introduce into my own language here in my own company's operations. It's not near peer, it's peer. And AI is not a revolution, it's an evolution. I like those in particular. I think that's going to change the way I approach my daily work. But I'll end with something more broad and towards the future. You spent 38 years in active duty. You're obviously in transition now, and as a veteran, clearly staying very close to the community that you're an expert in and worked in for many years. What do you see as the great opportunities in the next 38 years? What are you excited about here at the next equally lengthed chapter of your own work in public service? Are there areas of particular excitement that you're looking forward to?
So initially I was looking at very broadly. I wanted to stay engaged on the national security front. But it wasn't until you and somebody else kind of pulled me into the AI side of the house, because I hadn't given it a lot of deep thought. But that has now become a focus area on how this continues to evolve in the future. And, how do we make it more effective, but how also you can make the systems and the tools and the capabilities more effective, but it's also, how do you get the personnel, the commanders, the troops, fielded forces? The only way that we're going to be effective with this is, picking this up when we're in combat operations is the absolute wrong way to go about doing business. That will guarantee failure. So you got to let the young soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians play with it, break it, ring it out, figure out what's the best way to employ it. You have to train the way we're going to fight. And that's the part of getting that into the day-to-day business. And there's still, I think it's gotten better, but I still think there's trepidation and trust issues. And that's great. So work with it, play with it, exercise with us. And then, we can start to either fix some of the things may be valid concerns or problem sets, or decrease that level of trepidation. So when it does become a shooting war, it is just another tool in the toolbox. It's not the panacea. It's not going to solve everything, but it's something else that you're going to be able to use to your advantage to be able to win.
Well, thank you, D-Day, for sharing your perspectives on this. Unfortunately, that's all we're going to have time to cover today. I wish we could go deeper into some of those great stories that you started to outline, but it's good to hear that you're going to stay as part of that swirl of AI, it sounds like. We are going to be working within the field that we were just collectively criticizing for a little bit. Before we wrap, though, if people wanted to follow up with your work, what's the best place for them to go? Are you on the LinkedIn? Are you on the socials?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's the other thing is a trained intelligence professional. You kind of, minimize it. If you try and find me on Facebook, you won't. I'm not there.
Actually, that's good. I think I'm still on Facebook, but I haven't logged in like 5 or 10 years. I probably should delete that account. I haven't been on there.
Instagram, definitely not on TikTok. We can have another hour discussion about why that's a bad idea that revolves around artificial intelligence and training. But LinkedIn, you can hit me there, and it may take me a little while. It's not something I check on a daily basis, but I'll get back to you. I would say that's the easiest way to be able to do that.
It is funny, by the way, as a personal point in closing, how many national security professionals are on LinkedIn. I feel like they just discovered it like 2-3 years ago. Like it's the way Facebook was in the early 2000s. Everyone's on it and it's got into it. It's really exciting, but be careful what you post. I'm like, this has been around for decades. And yet somehow it is the primary mode and perhaps even the very place that we're going to post this podcast. And so with that, I'll close it off here. D-Day, retired Major General Daniel Simpson. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And for those that are listening, we encourage you to follow us at the next installment, where we'll continue to explore how defense is being disrupted.